Good morning, everyone. My name is Joanna Skinner. I'm the Senior Program Officer with the Johns Hopkins Center for Communication Program, and I lead our Population and Reproductive Health Portfolio on Breakthrough Action. I'm happy to welcome you here today to our third webinar in a series of our shared agenda for social and behavior change in family planning. And I'll turn it over now to our moderator, Dr. Christine Galavotti from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, who's going to lead us through the session today on social norms and family planning. So Chris, over to you.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, this is Chris Galavotti with the family planning team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And I'm so glad everyone could join. Let me start by going through some logistics. Today's webinar and slides will be in English, but there is simultaneous interpretation into French. And before we start the webinar, everyone needs to select a language option. So please look at the bottom of your Zoom screen and locate the globe icon that says interpretation. Please select your preferred language, English or French. And if you're choosing French, you can click on mute original audio if you don't want to hear the English narration in the background. If you are on an Android or Apple mobile device, in your meeting controls, tap the three dots, then tap language interpretation, and then tap English or French. If you select French, please toggle mute original audio if, again, you don't want to hear the English narration in the background. A few additional logistics before we get started. The webinar is being recorded and we will share audio and slides. All participants will be on mute for the webinar. Please also turn off your video as this will help those with lower bandwidth. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of the presentation, so please add your questions to the Q&A box at any time, and we will try to get to as many as we can at the end. Please feel free to add comments or questions in English or French. Someone will be monitoring the Q&A box for French questions and will translate them for our speakers so that the translators can say questions simultaneously in French. So now to introduce the topic of today's webinar. In the last 5 years, the family planning community has had renewed energy to prioritize family planning in national health strategies and advocate for increased funding for family planning through development and implementation of costed implementation plans. Despite this commendable and coordinated effort, in many cases, we know there's still a lack of coordination and prioritization of social and behavior change, SBC, for family planning. Unfortunately, this has resulted in duplication of efforts in some cases and critical gaps in others. As such, USAID's flagship social and behavior change project, Breakthrough Action, who are hosting today's webinar, has worked with numerous donors, coordinating mechanisms, and implementing partners to develop and validate a global shared agenda for SBC and family planning. The shared agenda, which is available on the project's website and will be posted in the chat box, outlines 5 priority areas for enhanced coordination in SBC and family planning, including improving SBC for service delivery, supporting social change for family planning, understanding and meeting the needs of youth, increasing coordinated investment in SBC for family planning, and focusing on Francophone West Africa. Over the course of 2020, Breakthrough Action is hosting several webinars to further the discussion around each of the global shared agenda priority areas I just listed. And each of these webinars is being recorded and posted on the project website. This third webinar in the series is focusing on the priority area of supporting social change for family planning. The social aspect of SBC is a critical component of achieving FP goals. In many cases, where progress in family planning use is lagging behind desired fertility preferences, social barriers continue to prevent potential clients from demanding, accessing, and using modern contraceptives. Social change, of course, is not simple, It involves a complex dynamic of factors, including social and gender norms, policy and structural factors, and social accountability approaches that enable communities to hold health providers, services, and governments accountable for their performance. In many cases, social change cuts across multiple health and development sectors as well, outside of family planning, and can serve as an opportunity to promote greater cross-sectoral integration. There is still much progress to be made in terms of understanding social change and appropriate SBC approaches that can support it. And of course, this implies attention to the ethical aspects of social change as well. And we can make faster progress, we think, by working together. Collaboration and coordination can go a long way to helping us reach these shared goals. So in today's webinar, we're going to hear from 4 speakers. First, Nicola Jones, Director of Gender and Adolescence for the Global Evidence Project, GAGE, and Principal Research Fellow at the Overseas Development Institute, ODI. Excuse me, will present how the work of GAGE is furthering our understanding of, there's a little bit of background noise, someone mute, is furthering our understanding of the role of social and gender norms in adolescent sexual and reproductive health. She's going to share findings on change strategies to support adolescent capabilities and identify some emerging research questions, excuse me, and program effectiveness. Excuse me. Next, Brian Shaw, Senior Research Manager at the Institute for Reproductive Health, will explore the challenges in measuring social and gender norms for family planning and share recommendations on harmonizing measurement based on work from the Social Norms Learning Collaborative. Next, Kate Lane, Director of Adolescence and Youth at FP 2020, will discuss why transforming social and gender norms was elevated to a focused area for Beyond FP 2020, the implications of this for SBC and service delivery programs, especially for youth, and what's next in working together to advance social norm change. Lastly, Telesfori Kabori, Senior Advisor on Community Health, and Shannon Pryor, Advisor for Family Planning and Reproductive Health, both with Save the Children, will share insights on what makes social change programs so difficult, even when we know they are essential to lasting behavior change. And as I said, there'll be time for Q&A at the end of the presentations, so please add your questions to the chat box at any time, and we'll be monitoring those. So thank you very much for joining us this morning. And Nicola, I'd like to turn it over to you to kick us off.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Next slide, please. So what I'm going to do today is to briefly introduce the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Program and then share some of the findings related to the linkages between gender norms and adolescence knowledge and access and use of contraception, and then finish up with some thoughts related to implications for programming and policy solutions. So next slide, and next slide again, please. So to start with, adolescence, as many of you will recognize, is increasingly seen as a window of opportunity whereby puberty brings about not only profound changes physically, but also cognitively. And this presents some very exciting opportunities for intervention because of the ways in which young people process social information. But at the same time, it's also the juncture in the life course where social norms become more rigidly enforced and personally salient in early adolescence. And so we see, for example, that girls' worlds often narrow during the second decade of life as boys' worlds expand. And so that's the problematic in which this work is situated. So next slide, please. So the what's critical is thinking about the demographic imperative of this, and adolescents make up 1/6 of the world's population and also are disproportionately affected by multidimensional poverty. So it's a really critical
juncture in the life course. It affects many young people, but they have multi-dimensional challenges in ensuring access to quality sexual and reproductive health services. Next slide, please. So the Gender and Adolescence Global Evidence Program, it's a longitudinal research initiative whereby we're following 20,000 adolescent girls and boys in South Asia, East Africa, and the Middle East. And it's the largest cohort of adolescents in the global South. And the aim of the study is to better understand what works for whom, where and why, so that we're able to harness that knowledge to better support adolescents to maximize their capabilities both now and in the future. Next slide, thanks. And our survey work with 2 cohorts of adolescents is then complemented by more in-depth qualitative and participatory research with adolescents themselves, their siblings, caregivers, and community actors. Next slide. So with that, by way of a brief background, I'd now like to focus in on some of the key findings from our work related to adolescence and contraceptive knowledge and uptake. And I think what's really critical here to highlight is that in much of the global South, sexual debut and adolescent pregnancy are the result of child marriage, not adolescent sexual experimentation. And this has very significant implications for how social messages are framed and delivered, as girls' demand for contraception is often shaped very heavily by their husbands and by their in-laws. And you can see here the extent to which in each of the focal countries where we're looking, pregnancy is happening within marriage. Next slide, please. So our findings highlight that across countries, adolescents have very little information about contraception, and that girls consistently have better information than boys. But this is because they're far more likely to be married than boys of the same age. And child marriage and sexual debut, as I mentioned, are tightly linked. However, even most married girls we find, for example, in Jordan and Bangladesh, are unable to name a form of contraception. And our qualitative research underscores that adolescents' lack of knowledge is driven by adults' inability to talk about sexual topics. The only exception that I have highlighted here is in parts of Oromia and Ethiopia, where we found that girls were less likely to be able to name a form of contraception than boys. And that was really because of social norms operating there that prioritize early fertility. So while the community health workers in other parts of the country are able to work with married girls to help them delay pregnancy until their bodies mature, interviews that we undertook with health extension workers in this part of the country highlighted that even though it's their official mandate to be discussing contraception with married girls and young women, they're not doing so because of the very strong gender norms in the communities in which they reside. And that prohibits those discussions. Next slide, please. So across countries, adolescents' exposure to sexuality is increasing through mass media and social media, and in so doing, shifting social norms. So for example, in Palestine and Jordan, we heard girls speaking repeatedly about watching different romantic TV series and learning about sexual behavior in that way. And boys, for example, admitting to downloading and watching porn from quite early ages. Adults also spoke in urban areas about the ways in which social media and mobile phones are increasingly encourage what they would describe as illicit relationships, i.e. those that are not arranged by parents. So because of parents focusing on the illicit nature of these relationships, they are only really providing adolescents with timely and accurate information about how their bodies work and how to keep themselves safe. And this means we found that what young people know or think they know is often wrong and contributing to high rates of unplanned pregnancy. Next slide, please. So we found overall that unmarried girls have the least access to contraceptive knowledge, because while boys' premarital sexual activity may be tolerated, girls' sexual purity is generally considered central to their honor and that of their families. So for example, in Bangladesh, in our interviews with Rohingya girls, we found that NGO workers admitted that while they were teaching adolescents about how pregnancy happens, they were not teaching them about how it could be prevented. Next slide, please. In terms of married girls, we found that they often also have limited access to knowledge and control over their bodies and their fertility because of social norms that value them for their reproductive capacity. So for example, with our sample in Jordan and Palestine, we found that married girls as young as 13 sometimes reported that they were threatened with divorce if they did not fall pregnant within just a few months. And indeed, we found it was more common for adolescent girls in those contexts to be reporting using fertility treatments than contraceptive devices. Next slide, please. I think what's interesting is that we are now seeing a wide range of programs working with adolescents that are aiming to shift these norms. And whereas in the past they were of relatively small scale, the three examples that I've listed here, of which we're engaged as evaluation partners, are working with between 50,000 to 250,000 young people through national platforms. So the scale is very exciting, but I think what our mixed methods research to date has highlighted that while there are some reported increases in knowledge about contraceptive and family planning options, a key challenge is often mentors and communities ingrained social norms that limit what they actually teach. So even though it might be part of the formal curriculum, what we're hearing is that most of the content is focused on menstruation, for example, and abstinence. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to skip through to the slide 18, please. I can return in the question time to our findings relating to the importance of having messages that are fit for purpose in different contexts. But just to conclude with some thoughts around policy and programming implications, our headline finding is that to improve adolescents' knowledge about contraception and its uptake, there's an immediate need to alter the discourse around adolescent sexuality in general and girls' sexuality in particular. And here we outline the importance of working both with adolescents themselves, but also particularly with parents to ensure that they have access to accurate information, are able to support the young people in their lives, but then working with the gatekeepers of social and gender norms, including religious leaders and service providers themselves, to ensure that the services that they are providing are both adolescent and gender responsive. So I'll finish up there. Thank you.
Thank you, Nicola. Go ahead, Brian.
Great. So good morning. My name is Brian Shaw, and I'm going to be speaking with you really far too briefly about some of our efforts to measure social norms, those unspoken rules that we really are increasingly finding have a great deal of influence on human behavior and use of family planning. I'm speaking primarily under one of my hats with the Learning Collaborative to Advance Normative Change, a network of social norms and behavior change experts supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and USAID. And I'm going to speak a bit about the challenges our community faces when trying to measure social norms related to family planning, as well as some of our efforts that the community has taken to seek consensus and to harmonize measurement of social norms. I say seeking consensus because this is still very much a work in progress. So next slide. So I'd like to start by sharing work that our colleagues at FHI 360 did in 2016, 2017, really at the start of the Learning Collaborative. That was a baseline of sorts in our understanding of how many and what kinds of social norms measures researchers and practitioners were using in the family planning world. Our colleagues conducted a systematic literature review of primarily quantitative social norms measures relating to contraceptive use. And after applying a set of quality criteria, we really found only 17 published studies that were assessing social norms related to contraceptive use. Now, among these, they really found a very limited geographical range. They also found that most of these measures were used in less rigorous data collection efforts, mostly cross-sectional without random sampling. So there really were few examples of research efforts that could really measure change in social norms and behaviors over time. No item or scale was used more than once across the studies, and these norms measures really range from asking just a single item about norms to 26 items. So from very, very simple single item measures to very complex 26 item measure scales. So finally, there were very few examples of measures that assess really what we think are all of the key components of social norms: descriptive and injunctive norms, as well as reference groups. So the next slide. So I set up the challenges of social norms measurement related to family planning a bit with the last slide, but one of the biggest challenges is that social norms are multifaceted given their social nature. And it's considerably easier to ask about an individual's personal attitudes and behaviors in questionnaires. And actually, we found a number of examples within the family planning literature that use these individual attitudes items, and really we're using them to talk about social norms, which may not necessarily be the most appropriate way to think about social norms. So experts in our collaborative generally agree that in order to measure social norms, we really need to attend to perceptions of an individual about what is the typical behavior in a community. For example, do most people in my community use modern contraception, which we also call descriptive norms. We also should be assessing those perceptions about whether this behavior is approved of within their community, also known as injunctive norms. And third, we should be assessing reference groups for a given individual, or the group of people whose opinions are really important to an individual for a given behavior. And finally, we have some sort of agreement that it is important to assess sanctions, or whether complying or not with the norm results in positive or negative reactions from others, which can really give insights into the strength of normative influence on behavior. So next slide. So I've mentioned that measuring norms is challenging due to their multifaceted nature, but they're also quite challenging to measure given they are tangible and highly context specific. This latter is probably one of the biggest challenges related to the goal of, say, developing social norm scales that can be used across countries, target groups and behaviors. As well, individuals really belong to many different groups that often have competing influences on a behavior, such as the use of family planning. Another challenge is that norms may directly influence a behavior, but they may also indirectly influence a behavior. In my own work, we see, for example, norms around intimate partner violence having indirect effects on the use of modern contraception. Other challenges really are that measurement approaches often rely on individual level theory. And one of the most common issues we see is that researchers and practitioners, as I was mentioning, conflate individual attitudes with social norms. Now, ultimately, due to these challenges and others, there really is little available guidance on efficient measures of social norms for interested researchers and practitioners within the family planning world. So next slide. So to briefly describe the Learning Collaborative, we are a network of 429 academics, practitioners, researchers, funders, and more from over 100 organizations. We're divided into 3 communities: theory, measurement, and scale up. And it is really the goal of this measurement community in the middle, led by IRH and FHI 360, to seek consensus on processes to measure social norms, as well as fill in the gaps in guidance for social norms measurement. Next slide. So the measurement community has developed a number of key products that I'd like to mention as resources that some of you all might be interested in to essentially fill in some of those gaps and provide some guidance on social norms measurement processes. So our community developed a formative toolkit for assessing social norms. We developed a map of norm shifting interventions and measurement efforts, including a large number that relate to family planning, in partnership with the Overseas Development Institute's Align platform. Based on expert review of those measurement efforts that we collected for this map, we also developed a practical guidance resource for practitioners interested in measuring social norms. And I'll talk about each of these 3 products a little bit more in depth in the remaining slides. But also the Learning Collaborative had a special supplement in the Journal of Adolescent Health in April of 2019, with many of these publications really discussing in-depth measurement efforts related to family planning, particularly in low and middle income countries. So next slide. So our first and perhaps most widely used product to date is the Social Norms Exploration Tool, which is a very useful toolkit for formatively assessing what norms matter for a target group, a given geography, and a given behavior. It's a rapid participatory process and makes good use of vignettes or short hypothetical scenarios to which a participant can respond in a potentially less biased manner. This is a technique that we're seeing increasing use of within the social norms measurement world. Now, ultimately, this tool can be quite useful for both intervention design and adaptation, but also is very instrumental and useful for the development of social norms items and measures in a particular context to consider for assessing and evaluating norm shifting and behavior change interventions. So next slide. So next, we reached out to our Learning Collaborative network and snowballed into their networks to collect and develop a searchable map of case studies of norm shifting interventions. In addition to information on the intervention, many of which relate to family planning, we collected information on their social norms measurement activities. So if they had taken any. So on this map, you can access their tools and measures and see, for example, how a faith-based initiative in Kinshasa is assessing norms around family planning and intimate partner violence among first-time parents and newly married couples, just as an example. So we partnered with the Overseas Development Institute's Align platform to make this map public and searchable, and the link is below should you have interest in looking up any particular behavior, geography, or setting. So next slide. So based on that map, we conducted an expert review of all of the existing social norms measures and measurement efforts that we collected for this map. And based on that review, we put together a resource guide for measuring social norms for practitioners. For this guide, we recognize that interested practitioners might be at various stages in their work, and tailored guidance for assessing and measuring social norms based really on where a practitioner might be along a continuum, starting from very little understanding of the influence of norms for a given behavior and setting, such as in the explore phase, where we give examples and guidance on available tools, such as that social norms exploration tool that I mentioned, which can really help sort of formatively identify relevant norms and reference groups to be considered for measurement. We also discussed the importance and examples of conceptual frameworks in the design and align phase, and in particular, how these can strengthen measurement efforts. Next, we provide guidance and examples of the measure phase, which is when you really have conducted formative research and developed or refined a conceptual model and are ready to actually operationalize the measurement plan with the items and scales that you'll be using to assess and evaluate norm shifting and behavior change interventions. So finally, the guide includes guidance on understanding and acting upon those findings from these social norms measures. So next slide. So just some concluding points, and I'd love to talk a lot more about these in question and answer session, but social norms are really complex and challenging to measure. But we have come to some sort of consensus in terms of when we're assessing social norms, we should be assessing both descriptive and injunctive norms, typical and approved behavior, those reference groups that really matter for an individual, as well as potential sanctions that they might face for either complying or not complying with the social norm. So there is a growing body of work focused on measuring social norms related to family planning. We're going to be following up with that initial literature review, and we suspect that we'll find a lot more examples of measures and be taking a look at what remaining gaps that there still are. Measurement approaches really depend on the stage of programming, and we do have some resources that exist to guide practitioners and researchers. And finally, just really critically, good formative work is really critical to program, to measurement, as well as programming, to really set up these measures. So next slide. I'd like to thank you and provide some links for many of the tools. If you have any interest in any of them, the links are all available within this presentation, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Brian. Over to you, Kate.
Forgot to unmute myself. Thanks, everybody. Good morning and good afternoon. I have to say I'm really pleased to see that we're having more and more of these conversations about the influence of social norms on the health of young people. I think these conversations are long overdue, and it's really quite exciting to see more and more energy being sort of mobilized to look at the influence of social norms on young people's ability to act on the information that we provide and to make use of services that are available. As you all know, this is the last year of the FP 2020 partnership. And this last year, we've been really delving into where the partnership goes in 2021 and beyond to 2030. And we do hope that our convening power and our platforms will still provide a place and a spotlight on these persistent issues and norms so that we can really see the type of progress that we need to see. So next slide, please. So in the last year, we've been working closely with our partners to really create and shape the next vision for FP 2020. And we consulted over 1,000 stakeholders in national and international settings across a range of constituencies, donor governments, government representatives, the private sector, faith groups, young people, civil society, etc. And the key themes that have really emerged in these consultations that stakeholders really want us to address in the next iteration of the partnership is women, health, and their access to contraception, which people believe can be best achieved by a stronger focus on young people, ensuring that the commitments are country-driven and government-led, and that we really focus our energies on increasing and sustaining contraceptive access and use. Next slide, please. So our final vision statement is here. Working together for a future where all women and adolescent girls everywhere have the freedom and ability to make their own informed decisions about using modern contraception and whether and when to have children, to lead healthy lives and participate as equals in society and development. And I've highlighted two phrases here, their own informed decisions and participate as equal. And those words were really deliberately selected to acknowledge the role and power of norms and the value that the next iteration of the partnership places on gender. The next iteration of the partnership places on gender. Oh, just got an echo. Okay. It's enough to generate individual demand and ensure a steady supply of quality services and products if women and adolescent girls must conform to norms that constrain their ability to use contraception, such as early marriage, expectations around demonstrating fertility, and pervasive expressions of sexual violence, force, and coercion. And we are in the next iteration of the partnership committed to tackling the root causes that prevent women and girls from being able to make these healthy choices and decisions around contraceptive use, and supporting the development of positive social norms related to women's health as well as the health and well-being of their families and communities. Next slide. So in the next iteration of the partnership, we see 5 areas of emphasis. One is to expand the narrative and shape the policy agenda. And what we mean by this is that family planning is important to the achievement of broad health and development outcomes, as well as prosperity, universal health coverage, human capital, and human rights. We need to drive data and evidence-informed decision-making, which we see as a success would be our ability to collect and use high-quality data in decision-making. The third is to increase, diversify, and efficiently use funding. And what we mean by that is we need to increase available funding. We need to ensure funding is resilient and sufficient. And we need to mobilize domestic resources, the private sector, and donors to continue supporting family planning. We need to improve system responsiveness to individual rights and needs. And by that, we mean health systems need to be better able to meet the information, service, and supply needs of all individuals, including young people. And then finally, the last one is to transform social and gender norms. And we all know this is a heavy lift, but we need to be paying more attention to the fact that a woman or an adolescent girl's decision to use modern contraception is supported and accepted by her family and by her community. Next slide. So we know that social and cultural and gender norms directly affect the choices and decisions of women and adolescents. We know that norms influence reproductive health outcomes and behaviors, such as their use of contraception, and that norms vary from country and region. But the current priorities for advocacy and programs, the current priorities for us to address norms and for advocacy and programmatic activities are around early marriage, sexual and gender-based violence, girls' education, men as partners, and healthy timing and spacing of pregnancy. Excuse me. Dog barking. Okay, it's important to remember that many of the countries where we work are more framed as collectivist cultures that value family and community over individuals. For example, pregnancy and childbearing is not necessarily seen as an individual choice, but as a benefit and a concern for the entire community, which is much different from how Americans and Europeans often perceive childbearing, which is more of a private matter. It's still common for communities to perceive contraception as a major contributor to infertility, which of course runs counter to many pronatalist societies. I'd also like to point out that many of these norms disproportionately affect adolescents, which underscores the importance of supporting positive normative change among this age group. And I'd like to point out also that some of the research that Georgetown University's Institute for Reproductive Health has done in Uganda in collaboration with Pathfinder found that individual norms and beliefs are really significantly molded in adolescence as young people explore their own beliefs, their values, and attitudes and those of their families and peers, which is a completely normal process and a necessary part of adolescence. It's certainly much easier to provide an opportunity for young people to consider their values and adopt life principles as a cohort than it is to go back and try to get individuals to change and adopt new norms. So if we are successful in achieving these normative changes, a woman or an adolescent girl's decision to use modern contraception, as I said earlier, is supported and accepted. Next slide. So what is going to really enable us to successfully shift norms? We've framed it in 3 different ways. The first one is we need to do more around multi-sectoral partnerships. We want to do more to integrate family planning within the broader health reform activities and universal health coverage. We see integrating family planning with other social programs that reach young people, education, youth development, and women's empowerment activities. We need to do more to engage in humanitarian settings and crises, which often disproportionately affect young people. Partner with men's organizations. Nicola's slide earlier talked about the fact that men are incredibly influential in young women's decisions around using contraception. And we want to facilitate local governments to provide good. Next slide. We want to champion new solutions to these persistent barriers. So we plan to invest in and support local leaders and experts to hone their skills and advocate for the development of evidence-informed policies and programs. We want to facilitate synergies with organizations that are addressing these root causes of early marriage and sexual and gender-based violence. And we really want to partner with and support the capacity building of youth-led organizations to generate new ideas and approaches. Next slide. And finally, we want to really support local actors to enact transformative change. So doing more to invest in behavioral analyses and emphasizing the influence of gender on individuals' behaviors, setting long-term goals for social change. We need to identify the right indicators. We need to measure the progress. We need to help programs and governments practice this adaptive management to be able to integrate these findings into their programs and do a better job of disseminating lessons learned. We need to do more around documenting and analyzing the relationship between social norms and social and behavior change communications to increase the use of services, and finally facilitate the scale up of these evidence-informed approaches. And next slide. We have much more work to be done. Obviously, we are still in the last year of the of 2020. In the next year or so, we will be developing and finalizing the architecture for the post-2020 partnership. We will be announcing our new structure at ICFP 2021. And we are now standing up a transition team to help us guide the process. So stay tuned, lots more conversations to be happening in this space. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. And now, finally, I will turn it over to our colleagues from Save the Children.
Thank you. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm happy to be with you today and present with my colleague Telesfor Kabore, who will close out the presentation. So we've heard from the previous presenters about the important role of social change on family planning and ASRH. I wanted to share a few insights from Save the Children's experiences and then talk through some challenges and considerations when implementing these programs. Next slide. So in my first example, I'll share experiences from Nepal that helps add to the case for why we work to transform social and gender norms for family planning. The Fertility Awareness for Community Transformation Project, or FACT, funded by USAID and led by the Institute for Reproductive Health. Save the Children was a lead implementing partner in Nepal and Uganda. And the interventions I will describe were all developed using formative research that was conducted to inform the design. So Pragati is a series of 9 games that were developed to diffuse information on fertility awareness, family planning methods, how they work, side effects, and misconceptions, and to encourage reflection on social and gender norms about family planning. IRH led a mixed methods quasi-experimental study, and you can see the results on this slide. Married women in the Pragati arm with a high family planning norm score were 2.1 times more likely to be a current family planning user and intend to use family planning in the future. Next slide. So the ADN project was also part of FACT and was implemented in the Karamoja region of Uganda. The intervention included peer group meetings, community theater performance performed by the peer group members that included discussion to encourage reflection in the community with viewers after each scene. And then there were linkages to the health system. A quasi-experimental mixed method study was found that those who viewed the community theater performances were more likely than non-viewers to intend to use modern family planning, seek health information from a health worker, and have higher couples communication about family planning. Next slide. So for this example, I wanted to highlight an example and opportunity for integration. Lahia was a development food security activity funded by USAID's Office of Food for Peace in the Maradi region of Niger. And in this program, we were able to incorporate some work on social norms and gender norms integrated with other health and nutrition work. So it's important to kind of see opportunities beyond just family planning. Next slide. Okay, so we know social change programs for family planning are feasible, but there are still challenges and considerations that need to be taken into account when planning. We've prioritized 3 challenges here: difficulties in implementing at scale, the perception that it takes a long time, and the important need to observe certain ethical considerations. Next slide. So programs are heavy and difficult to scale. I find it valuable to highlight that social change can be inherently scaled. While your intervention may reach only a few, if you do it right, you can change norms in the whole community. Social change programs can have large-scale impact and may be highly sustainable, but they can be difficult to implement with quality and fidelity across larger geographies. So with that in mind, it's important that we're realistic about timeline and budget, and that we consider trade-offs when thinking about social change programs. What is the balance between deep community work that is necessary to create lasting and community-driven change, and the need to keep interventions light and manageable for the systems that will sustain them? Next slide. Program takes lots of time and require lots of project staff level of effort. So again, we need to be realistic about project timelines and budget and what can be accomplished. I'd also highlight that your community facilitator or champion is often the heart of the program. When identifying them, consider their workload, interest, and internal drive. You also want to look for people who are comfortable asking questions rather than feeling they have the need to have all the answers themselves. Connected to the point above, and particularly if you're working with facilitators who might not come from the health or family planning space or may have low literacy, you need to plan for more frequent coaching, mentoring, supervision, especially as activities start. So your facilitator is comfortable with the content and delivering the content. And then I just wanted to note that there is currently some costing work that is ongoing to better understand the level of effort question, including some from the Passages project. So with that, I will pass to my colleague Telesphore.
Thank you, Shannon, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please, Eric. And oops, we are missing one slide on the ethical.
He had already switched to it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. So I'm sure we are all familiar with some sayings such as people owns better what they have created, or if you make decisions about me without me, you made them against me. And I'm sure we can go on and on with various examples of quotes with regards to that will kind of speak to the same thing I want to touch on. And maybe that's why it is sometimes so difficult to achieve social change, because we need to do that in a way that the people or the people we call audience or target, wrongly in my opinion, but those people at the end will be comfortable saying that they did it themselves. So there are therefore certain ethical considerations or basic principle we need to ensure we are abiding by. And some of them are just sharing 5 of them quickly. As first, community entry through proper protocols. Proper means here really ensuring that the way we are getting into the communities is kind of culturally and traditionally respectful of their own norms and how to introduce new things so that we can really negotiate their buy-in and not just go through a couple of community leaders who will ensure that everything is super perfect, we are in line with you and we can go on. And yet we've not taken time to ensure that we have real proper buy-in. Another issue that we oftentimes miss or fail to respect is really taking time to build relationship and maintain them over the course of our interventions. And we usually assume that, you know, by a phone call or by a letter inviting people to attend something is enough. And we usually do business as usual. But from my experience, if we really want to facilitate social change, we really need to gain people's minds and their souls so that they realize that we are them and they are us in the work that we are doing. Another ethical consideration to bear in mind is, I mean, truly collective action. I don't want to say participatory, but really collective action throughout the life cycle of the project. And decision making for data utilization for decision making is another area I would like to insist. Not us as program team using data to inform our decision making, but really making sure that the communities are part of that data utilization of decision making. So they are not subject of a research, but they're actually actors of the research, and they're using the findings of the research themselves to inform some of the decisions in terms of micro planning or local solutions they will implement. And lastly, for social accountability reason, we really need to pay close attention to the type of feedback loops that we could put in place to ensure that communities' voice are really heard. Next slide, please. Yes, continue, Eric, with the 4 bullets. Thank you. So what are the priorities for collaboration for us as a global community of SBC family planning practitioners? I'm sharing here just 4 items. Of course, it can go beyond that. But to my opinion, these 4 items are really important. For me, first, we could collaboratively work on documentation or research to document various approaches on how we can really strengthen the field practitioners' capacity to do proper SBC programming. I think there are here and there some researches and some evidence that have been produced, but I think it's not widely shared and widely taken up by the global practitioners. A second idea is, again, working on tools that will help us advocate with host government and donors to prioritize community system as part of the health system. For me, SBC it looks like a stepchild in this world of public health and social change that we often give priority to biomedicals, and we really need to make sure that this becomes a priority agenda. Similarly, I think it's worth working on tools to help us advocate with local government and municipalities to prioritize SBC. How do we ensure that SBC is part of local government and municipalities' agenda? Because there are decentralization processes going on across countries in the developing world, and if there is no proper planning and budget allocation for such activities, we cannot sustain that type of work. And I couldn't refrain from making that point with all what we're seeing right now with the rumors and the lack of trust in the scientific and public health practitioners community. I think we have a big deal of work to do together to ensure that we are rebuilding trust and ensuring that communities regain trust into the health system at some point, because that's also something that's going to be quite challenging, because nowadays it's like no one trusts anyone anymore. So next slide. I thank you so much for your attention, and I'm more than happy to address some of the questions you may have.
Great, thank you so much to all of the speakers. And now I'd like to turn to some of the questions we've received. I'll try to get to as many as possible, but let me start with Nicola. And I think there were some questions around how your data, that there were some real gaps in adolescents' knowledge about modern contraception, stands in some contrast to DHS data, which typically shows that female respondents of all ages can name at least one type of method. And could you kind of reflect a little bit on that? Why do you think your findings are more suggestive that that's a bigger gap than we might have thought?
Thanks. I think it's a good question. The first thing is that we have a focus on vulnerable adolescents in line with the Leave No One Behind sustainable development agenda. So I think that, you know, partly it's reflecting that. So we include adolescents from, you know, remote, rural and pastoralist communities. So I think, you know, that's definitely part of it. I think also the fact that we are focusing, as someone had highlighted in the questions, on adolescence exclusively, that we are getting a broader range of young people. We do include married girls, so not just girls at risk of child marriage, but married girls as a dedicated sample. And I think in many you know, larger surveys, they're often not accessed because of stigma or, you know, concerns around legality and answering questions related to marital status. And then also reflecting on some of the points that were made about, you know, gaps in humanitarian settings. You know, the work that we're doing in Bangladesh is with, you know, includes a large cohort of Rohingya refugees, and then in Jordan and Lebanon with Palestinian and Syrian refugees. So I think, you know, highlighting the additional disadvantage that young people in those contexts of displacement face.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. Next to Brian, I have a question. In thinking about, you laid out sort of 4 different dimensions of social norms that need to be measured to really understand the construct. You didn't mention outcome expectations as a potential measure that might capture a number of these things kind of in one set of measures. So I wondered if you could comment on that. What's the role of people's perception of, for example, what the consequences, either personal, social, or material, might be if they engage in a specific behavior? Outcome expectations.
Yeah, sure. I guess for us, we really see, and I guess this goes back to a problem with inconsistent use of terms. So for us, like, outcome expectations is very similar to expectations of sanctions. So should I, you know, use family planning? You know, how are, you know, my reference group going to react to me? So I think to answer your question, the outcome expectations is important. We see that as an element of this sort of 4th aspect of measuring social norms, sanctions, and assessments of outcome expectations would probably fall within some of the things that we're doing to assess the sanctions.
Okay, great. Kate, kind of a 2-parter question. How are these new post-2020 vision and strategies different? And what would you think is particularly distinct from the original FP 2020 vision and goals? And I might particularly point to what you said about collective perspective versus individual choice, which you mentioned as something that we don't often take into consideration. Is that reflected in this new vision?
So just to be clear, I've been at the FP 2020 Secretariat for about 1.5 years. So really watched it from afar when it was launched in 2012. But I think that, you know, it's been a very iterative process. When the initiative was launched in 2020, it was very much focused on 120 million new users of contraception. by 2020. And over time, we began to tinker with that and began to bring in other ideas and thoughts and principles around, rights-based family planning to ensure that, programs were not being coercive in trying to achieve commitments and goals that were set out by countries to achieve that higher level, that high number of 120 million. And I think we've begun to pay more attention to the fact that social norms are really, really influential on both the supply and the demand. And, often we approach our family planning programs very much from a supply demand perspective. And it's been great to see the evolution of the conversation to begin to think more about social norms and the effect of social norms on both supply and demand. And when you think about adolescence specifically, social norms really constrain the supply of services to young people because they get a limited method choice. The services that are available simply aren't responsive to their particular needs. And so we need to do more around the supply side to make those services more responsive to young people, as well as being able to offer them the full range of contraceptive methods, tackling things like provider biases, systemic problems that really are not supportive of young people's access to services. We also have to tackle the demand side as well. And one of the challenges that has become much more apparent to me is we expect young people to act on their demand. Oftentimes young people do have a demand for contraception, but they don't necessarily feel comfortable going into a health facility and asking for services. And so recognizing that social norms constrain young people's ability to act on their desire to use contraception means to me that we need to do a better job of being more intentional in our outreach and initiating these conversations with young people as opposed to waiting for young people to demand or ask for contraception. In terms of the collectivist mindset, I thought I saw Judy Obell on the line. I went, and this has been something that's been nattering around in my head for a number of years. And Judy presented this about a year ago at a youth power meeting that really talked about the fact that so much of our work focuses on individual decision making, and the fact is people don't make decisions as individuals for their individual needs. They make it in the context of their families and their communities. So taking this more normative approach to the kind of work we do can support and reinforce individuals' choices and decisions. I'm not sure if I answered that question fully, but I tried.
Okay, thanks. Okay, well, let me move on. Shannon, you said something about, social norm change takes time. And since projects are usually implemented on a 3 to 5 year timeline, do you have any specific recommendations about what to do in that short time frame to accelerate that change?
Sure. I think I'll start by saying I don't have the magic answer. I wish I did. I think, I said it's important to be realistic, with which I really believe. Some change takes time and work. And then the other point is about that trade-off question, that when you're thinking about, okay, maybe we can make this lighter, which may be more sustainable, given the system you're integrating into, just that you're cognizant that you'll lose something with that. And so there's need to kind of have to consciously consider when you're designing programs.
Okay, and Telesfor, you laid out some really great principles for how to approach programming. And I noted that Shannon said something about this requires a lot of staff and a lot of resources. But in contrast, I think you said this requires kind of deeper community engagement and community lead and capacity building, or supporting and partnering with communities in order to really affect change, both as kind of ethical principles and programming principles. And I have two questions on that. One, do you think that that's particularly true when it comes to social norms and this kind of social norm change? And if so, why? And then secondly, if this is really key to social norm change, do we have a measurement agenda around that? How do we know we're building trust? What kind of measures do we have of that? How do we know we're actually centering community in these processes? So that's my question.
Yeah, I hope I will be able to, but yes, for me, for the first question, yes, true, it's applicable to social behavior and social change work. And even, in relation to the question you asked to Shannon, I think we really need to ensure that when we can start the work, again, having only 2 years or 3 years shouldn't be a reason we shouldn't be engaging in social and behavior change work. But we really need to ensure that even if we finish our mandate, the work should continue within the system, with what is in place to continue that type of work. So we need to build on existing structures, systems in such a way that even after the end of our mandate, a minimal work and conversation can continue. For me, that's how we can, in the long run, ensure that SBC is ensured. And in terms of measurement, and again, I think it can be measured. We never systematically and scientifically measure these kind of things. It usually happens anecdotally, but I do think that it can be measured, even not quantitatively, but qualitatively. We can find a way to ensure that we are building trust, and that is being measured. For example, the ability of a given community to speak their mind openly with you would really tell you that you are slowly gaining their trust, and they're feeling really open to express what they feel and the direction they want to take. Of course, if you are in a situation where you are, people, it's a yes, yes, yes. I mean, you should be telling yourself that there is something wrong there, because if you design something and you out of your office and you go to the communities and it's all accepted, the future direction, everything is accepted, there is definitely something wrong there with the way you are facilitating it, or with the way you are introducing your interventions. I know that with UNICEF and WHO, there is another stream of work happening right now around coming up with standards and indicators for measuring community engagement. That could be something interesting to bridge the gap with them and see how this is being done.
Great. Oh, thank you so much. Okay, a few more. I think we've got just a couple more minutes. Nicola, there was a question for you about your use of, kind of speaking of measures and methodologies for kind of understanding how this social norms and social change occur. Have you been using realist evaluation? And if so, can you talk a little bit about in what ways?
Yes, no, good question. So yes, our starting point was indeed Pawson's work. So where he, maps out outcomes, causal mechanisms, and context, and we've translated that into a conceptual framework that we call the 3 C's, whereby we're focusing on adolescents' capabilities, then the change strategies that can bring about transformations in individual lives, but also in collective capabilities of adolescents. and then looking at the ways in which, you know, context factors mediate the effectiveness of those different programs. So I saw there are a number of questions about how do we select the countries we were working in. We had identified countries within the top third of the Fragile State Index, but then we're also wanting to work in environments where there were major multi-sectoral adolescent empowerment programs in place to try and understand the extent to which they were contributing to change in adolescents' lives. So that's sort of the broader conceptual framework in which we're working, and sort of linking that to another question that I saw that came up, which is relating to young people's agency. We do have in both our survey and in our qualitative instruments among young people's voice and agency, but I think what comes through very strongly on that is while adolescents sort of reported across contexts that they're able to negotiate around things like mobility and even access to education and to time for study, that there was much less room to maneuver in terms of sexual and reproductive health issues, both in terms of access to information and access to services and supplies. So I think, you know, that's something, you know, that requires further attention in terms of, you know, the future research agenda.
Okay, great. I think we've got one more minute, so I'm just going to open up to anyone on the panel who would like to answer. How about, you know, the current moment that we're in with COVID-19? How do you see social norm interventions, or, you know, what is the potential to do something positive in the social norm space given this particular period of time? Anyone?
For me, it makes it more challenging.
Yeah.
That's my first, you know, quick and gut reaction. It's make it more challenging. It justifies more the, you know, our work. I think we will have a lot of work to do, but it makes it more challenging. That's what I was trying to touch in my last point. Like, we really need to come together and find a way of rebuilding trust from the communities into the health system. You can easily see even vaccines and all that, everything is being challenged.
Yes.
Right now. So it brings more justification to our work, but more challenges, from my opinion.
Great. Okay, well, that's a great way to end the seminar. Let me just say a few things in closing. First of all, thanks to all of the presenters. That was really great. Thank you for sharing your work, and also to everyone who signed in to listen and share their questions. Please do read through the shared SBC agenda that Joanna posted in the chat, and think about how you can share and discuss it at your organization, and how you might be able to contribute to some of the recommendations for this priority on social change. As a reminder, the recording of this webinar will be posted on the Breakthrough website, along with all of the resources and links that were shared here today. And we really hope you can join us for future webinars on other priorities on the shared agenda. And you're going to see now a very brief survey appear on your screen. And the project would greatly appreciate it if you could take just a moment to answer the questions, which will really help in informing future webinars. So thank you again to everyone.